Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Crown and today we are going to have some more stories that I hope that you will enjoy. But before we start, it will be so much appreciated if you would subscribe to the channel, like the video if you enjoyed it, and maybe leave a comment down below. These simple clicks would mean a lot to the future of this channel and really reward the effort that I put in every day. And now, without further ado, let's go! First story. Kevin at my job today. So today I had my first proper Karen encounter. I work for a very notable moving truck company that also sells boxes and box accessories. We are no strangers to Karens. But this one was the first non-crazy Karen with rights and convictions I have encountered. The cast. Me, Coop, my co-worker because for some reason I'm thinking of Gordo Cooper, and Kevin, the hero of our story. So our story begins with me walking out from the back after filling up my bottle. I come through the door and see the hero of our story, Kevin the Wise, leaning up against a pallet of boxes. I missed the beginning of the conversation, but this is where it started for me. Coop says, "Sir, could you please put on your mask?" "You will say hello to me before speaking." "Sir, you can't be inside without a mask." "Excuse me." "You will say hello before saying anything to me." So I say to him, "Look, bud, there's two ways this can go. You either put on a mask, or you will have to leave the store. That's it. You will say hello before speaking to your customer." "Okay, get out." "Say hello, then you can tell me to leave." "Get out immediately. You are no longer welcome here." "If you don't treat me with respect, I'm going to leave and take my business elsewhere." "Fine by me." So our great and respect-deserving Kevin walks out of the store, but it's not over, because this will be a pretty boring story. This guy now insists on walking in and out of the front door, and we both tell him he must leave the property repeatedly. After about 20 minutes of this, him yelling "call the cops, go ahead," over and over and generally being a huge jerk to all the normal people walking in, I just did that. About 10 minutes later, the cop shows up and tells him that he is now trespassing and to leave immediately. Kevin then leaves, only to be caught by the cop about 5 minutes later, attempting to damage trucks at the back of the lot. He was then forcibly removed from the property and will be having a great night with that plastic blanket they give you in the PD holding cells. Next story. My first Karen encounter. After reading some of your posts, I realized that I also had the honor to meet a Karen in real life. I was at the passport office waiting for my number to be called. After about 2 hours of waiting, she entered the room. The big fur jacket, the big glasses, the classic Karen haircut. I wouldn't have noticed her if she wouldn't have been bathing in perfume before coming to the office. That deep scent made me physically ill. Yikes. But I digress. I was just standing in a corner with my eyes in my mobile games, just waiting. About another hour passes, then I hear it. Ahem. I raised my eyes at her. "What number do you have?" 114. "I have 666. Not exactly, but I figured it would be an appropriate number to be correlated to her. Then she tells me, "Wouldn't you like to switch numbers? I'm very busy and I don't have the time to wait. Your number will be called in any minute now." "Sorry, I'm waiting since the morning, and I don't want to wait more than expected." Kids these days, so entitled, so disrespectful. Would you do that to your mother too? No, because my mother would have come since the opening hours, as I did. How dare you talk to me like that? Then she proceeds to slap me. Unfortunately, I wasn't very fast and she didn't miss me. I began to scream like a crazy person and people began to stare. Luckily, a police officer took notice of our encounter and came to see what was happening. He asked us to come with him to the station that was just the next door. I obliged without even thinking a second about it, but Karen began to throw a tantrum like a 3-year-old and, as this officer couldn't control her, He had to call back up to escort the crazy lady to the police department. I just went with them. Of course, I pressed charges and she got a big fat fine. 6 months of prison and another 12 months of community service. Why that much? Because while she would throw in her tantrum, she actually tried to punch the cop. This happened about 5 years ago and I still have that smug smile when I think about that encounter. That slap was worth everything that happened to her afterwards. Next story. Drive into our yard to destroy snowmen? Okay then. This was just about 3 years ago. So my family owns a little house in Sweden. It's about 3 hours north of Stockholm. We often go there on vacations since we have a lot of vacations in Sweden. There were about 30 houses in the village we lived in at the time. In this village, there was this jerk that just bought a new expensive Porsche SUV that he flexed on everyone. Had a wealthy family and got the car from his dad. He was about 23 and had never made a single penny from his own work. I was always a spoiled kid. Now to the story. We had invited my best friend to join us while we went to our house during winter vacation, and we were going to stay there for 4 days, then go back to Stockholm. Me and my best friend built a bunch of mini snowmen. About 40 centimeters tall, or a little bit over 1 foot for you fellow Americans. On the side of the road when we were still making the snowmen, that jerk came in his SUV and drove over our snowmen. Me and my best friend were sad then. We went to tell my parents what happened. They said that they couldn't do anything about it since it was on the side of the road and not on our property. Me, my best friend, and my amazing dad and mom helped us build the snowmen again, but 1 to 2 meters into our property so that they would not be run over. At this time, we went in for lunch. We had a window from our dining room to our front yard where all of the snowmen were. Midway during lunch, we hear a loud vroom. All of us look out while we see the gray Porsche turn into our lawn and drive them all over. My mom was furious, and she began cursing him out, even though he wasn't there. Now my parents were in full revenge mode. We built even more snowmen, but this time my mom and dad put gigantic 14 centimeters 5-inch spikes in the bottom of them. We built many more than there were before, so that he would not be able to resist driving over them. Some hours later, we heard a loud bang outside. We immediately rushed to our window and saw the gray Porsche SUV in our lawn. The jerk inspects the wheels and then runs to our door, knocking like a maniac. Dad opens the door and before he could say a word, the jerk screams at him for ruining his tires and says that he's going to sue. The jerk starts cursing at him and Dad does the same. My mom takes us to their bedroom upstairs to prevent us from listening to this bad language. We were only 10 by that time. Then she goes down to help Dad with that jerk. Eventually, he never sued, and he ended up having to pay about $2,000 for the new tires that would match the ones he had. He did not have the normal wheels, but some special kinds. And of course for someone to put them on the car. Not many people liked him to begin with, but this definitely did not boost his reputation. Next story. Height approved. This isn't my story, but my parents. It was probably the first time I witnessed malicious compliance, and I still remember it well. It was about 25 years ago, so I was about 8. And we had just moved into a 150-year-old house that was in need of major repairs. My dad, thinking ahead, knew he would need a large garage or workshop to really get started on the renovations properly. On the edge of our yard was an ancient barn that was falling apart and needed to be torn down. My dad figured this was the best place to build his new workshop, so that was the plan. We had met and were on good terms with all the neighbors at that point. When the plans for the new workshop were finished, my parents went around to all the neighbors as a courtesy to show them the plans and get their blessings. The neighbors whose property the current barn and new workshop would border I will call them the Peters. They were concerned about the height. The existing barn was 16 foot high, and they asked if we could only build it one story, 12 feet max, so as to not block the sun in their yard. Sure, no problem. My parents agreed. They wanted to go 2 stories for extra storage, but just one wasn't a deal breaker. So the old barn was torn down and the foundation laid for the new one. During that time, there was a falling out with the Peters and my parents. I am not sure what happened, but it turned nasty. One day, my brother and I were playing street hockey, and Mr. Peters came out yelling at us, "Get off the road, you half-breed!" My dad is black, so we're both half-black. "You have to earn your place in this town." Upon hearing this, my mom had to physically restrain my dad from going over and beating the living heck out of him. Eventually, he cooled off, and he started on his plan. The plans for one story went out the window. Soon, the new garage that was only supposed to be 1 story soon gained a second in the blueprints. If they were going to direct racist comments at his kids, my dad would build what he wanted. As construction started, the Peters came over to ask why there were 2 stories being built, and they were told to go screw themselves. We did not hear from them again until the roof started to go on. The bylaws of the township limited all-out structures to 24 feet high. The bylaws of the township limited all-out structures to 24 feet high. The Peters called the township and then a building inspector, claiming that the new garage was over 24 feet high. If it was overhyped, the entire thing would have been torn down and rebuilt, costing us tens of thousands of dollars. I remember the Peters standing there watching the inspector with smug looks on their faces. 2 days later, we got the final report back from the township inspector, 23 feet 11 inches, just as my dad had drawn up in his plans. He sent me up on the roof of the garage, just plywood, no shingles yet, with some spray paint, and had me write 23 feet 11 inches, height approved, in 2-foot-high neon orange letters across the entire roof. The one that was facing their yard and house. Not only did the garage block all the sunlight from reaching their yard, but my dad waited until everything else was done before he shingled that side of the roof. They had to stare at those neon orange letters for almost 3 years. We did not hear a peep from them for the next 10 years until they moved. Next story. Local heroes takes it to City Hall. This happened quite a few years ago. Where my hometown is a thing called ALR, Agricultural Land Reserve. Basically, there are areas of land that can only ever be used for agriculture. In order to protect prime agricultural land from becoming highways and strip malls and things like that, a friend of a friend, let's call him Fred, had inherited a piece of such land on the outskirts of the city. He had no interest in doing any kind of farming, but the ALR rules allow for the property owner to have a personal residence on the land. So he built a house on it and had a nice place to live just outside of town. Now City Hall has ways of acquiring ALR land and using it for non-agriculture purposes. I am not familiar with how exactly, but they can. And it is about impossible for anyone else to. One thing the city would do is acquire ALR land and turn it into condo developments. They had a vision for 3 high-end condos to be built where Fred's property was. They had already bought the properties on either side of Fred's land and were going after him too. The city was only offering Fred the property value, and since he just built a house there, he would be losing on the deal, so Fred said no. While the condos on either side of Fred were being constructed, the city used every tool they could to try and expropriate Fred's land. But the ALR restrictions made it tricky. Finally, they told Fred that since his land was ALR, he needed to be using it for agriculture within 30 days, or they could take it from him. Fred's response? Pig farm. He crammed as many pigs onto his property that he legally could. full compliance with farming regulations, health and safety, the whole 9 yards. Since he had fulfilled his obligations with the ALR, the city could not touch him. Period. The city had already pre-sold a number of these condos and naturally, none of the buyers were very happy to have spent a small fortune to live next to a big, stinky, big farm. Most of the buyers obtained grounds for dismissal on their purchase agreements, while the rest filed a big lawsuit. The city's project was sinking fast. The city started negotiating with Fred. The story ends with the city finally making Fred an offer for his land that was so ridiculous. He had no choice but to accept. The city finished their condo project, but thanks to Fred, they did not make nearly as much off of it as they had anticipated. Next story. Fine. I'll let the dog out in the front yard instead. This happened a few years ago. At the time I was living with my then partner, now ex, and our dog in a small home with a fenced backyard. We had gotten robbed that summer, and while luckily the burglar was caught and we got our valuables back, the lock on the sliding glass doors to the backyard were broken. In typical fashion, my ex promised he would fix it, but weeks ticked by with no repair. My partner owned a house. He wanted to do all these home ownership things himself. He refused to call a locksmith, or even let me call a locksmith, or let me buy and fix the lock, but also never had the time to fix the lock himself. It was broken in a way that made it very hard to either lock or unlock. We would normally let our dog out in the backyard every morning to go to the bathroom, and during the week, he would just deal with it. But it was really hard for me to shove open the broken lock every weekend morning while he slept in. Multiple weeks in a row, I brought up the lock and how I couldn't let the dog out easily on early weekend mornings. He finally snapped at me one morning to just let her out front instead. Like I was stupid for not thinking of this sooner. So I did. Knowing full well the sprinklers were on in the front yard. They ran every weekend morning that early. Our pup happily went to the bathroom out front, under a sprinkler shower, and then bounded back into bed with him at 7 a.m., soggy and wet. My partner was mad, and he fixed the lock the next week. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.